All right, everybody, welcome to our webinar on Movement 101, Keys to Ageless Durability. So we have 30 minutes to do this. We're going to be flying through some of this stuff, but we're going to hopefully give you a lot of information about exercise and movement and what we think about that. And why don't we just start there? Exercise and movement. I don't know about you guys. I don't love the term exercise because typically when someone says exercise, I think about this lady over here who is clearly not having a good time. She's just not a good place. So we prefer to use movement. And we want to change how we think about that from like exercise. I associate that with pain, sweating, getting hurt. A lot of times, a lot of people avoid exercise or movement because they're afraid they're going to get hurt. Torture, some people associate it with that. But what if we thought about exercise or movement as medicine to treat the symptoms that are common as we age? So Dan and Nick and I are physical therapists, so we get to see a large range of people in ability and age. And what we typically see is towards the end of life, things don't go as well as when you were in your 20s, 30s, and 40s. And we're going to talk about that a little bit. We really feel like there's 5 components to movement. If you're going to be good at movement, you're going to have to be good at these things. And we're going to go through these in detail. Balance, strength, endurance, VO2 max, and mobility. So we know what those things mean. Probably the biggest one that jumps out to you guys might be the VO2 max thing. Some people listening to this may have never heard of that. We're going to explain that a little bit today and use some different terminology around it. But this is how we think of movement, and we're going to explain this individually. So balance. I always say this. You guys correct me if I'm wrong. Well, I'm not wrong, but balance is a skill. So my patients will come to me and say, yeah, I'm getting older, so my balance is supposed to get worse, right? But I always tell the patient when they say that, if you played a sport or even I think of it as a musical instrument, not sure why, just because I think if you put a musical instrument away, like if you played an instrument in high school. Dan, what instrument did you play in high school? They must have forced you to play an instrument, right?
Nope.
Nothing? Nick, did you play an instrument?
Not a chance.
What is going on? Our school system's failing us. Anyway, I played saxophone or guitar, pick whatever you want. I played it fairly well for a certain period of time, but then I just never touched it, never used it. And if you told me to play anything on a saxophone today, it would go very poorly. But that makes sense, right? I'm not spending any time working on it. I feel like balance is a skill. If you don't spend any time working on it, especially as you get older, then it makes sense that you're not going to have good balance. It's not something you just kind of give up on and say, well, I have terrible balance and I do the best I can with what I've got. But it's a skill. And but another thing that Nick and Dan and I always say is that if you're over the age of 65, you fracture your hip, really if you fracture your femur, but most people associate that with your hip, your mortality rate in the next 12 months is 30%. For those of you that do not know what mortality rate is, Nick, tell us what that is.
It means your chances of dying.
So just, a little bit under 1 out of 3 chance of you not being on the earth anymore if you're over the age of 65. So a lot of people that you're thinking about that may be listening to this or know people that are over the age of 65, and you're like, wow, they're, not in a wheelchair and completely incapacitated. They seem to be pretty good. The problem is that fracture can lead to a downward spiral in health, basically around some of the things that we're going to talk about today. So that's just kind of your scary statistic to get you to pay attention and to understand that this stuff is important. If you don't move as you get older, things are not going to go well. So common from my patients, as we've said, my balance is awful. I know that. I've had a few falls at home, but nothing bad has happened. And what I will say is nothing bad has happened yet. So this is not the prettiest looking graphic, but the dark area in here is accidental deaths in the United States as a result of falls. So Dan, I'll put you on the spot here. As you're looking at this, what is the thing that jumps out to you when you are looking at just the colors that are on here?
It's a huge jump in falls as we age, like the percentage becomes higher.
Yeah. So this is all accidental death. So there's the accidental overdose, transport accidents, falls, other. So any kind of accident. Like if I walk outside right now and get hit by a bus, as an accidental death. But for the most part, what is the biggest chunk of this is this dark color here, which is falls. So especially as you age over the age of 65, which we just talked about, you're just at a higher risk of dying as a result of an accidental fall. So that's balance. The next thing is going to be strength. So using your muscles to generate force, that's kind of the definition of strength, typically associated with larger. Usually the larger a muscle is, the more strength that it has. So the smaller it gets, the less strength that it has. But it's really closely related to balance. That's why we put it second here. If you have more muscle mass, you are less likely to fall. So without going into too much detail there, that should be a pretty straightforward thing. But typically, as we get older, part of the natural aging process is to lose muscle mass as we get older. But again, it's not something we want to reserve ourselves to. So the more muscle you have, the better you are at doing after you do have a fall, you better are at recovering after that. So the 70% that do survive falls when they're over the age of 65, right? We talked about, Nick said the chances of you dying is 30%. The 70% that don't die, they have larger muscles. And that again, without going into a ton of research, that's just a fact. So why is that, do you think, Nick? So why would, I know it might seem obvious to us, but if you have more muscle going into an injury, why are you more likely to do better coming out the other end?
Well, and here's where we talk about, well, weren't you just talking about a broken bone? And there's the exact correlation now. If you have larger muscles, you're stimulating them in some ways, generally through weight bearing, exercise, movement of some sort, resistance training. And by default of making those muscles bigger, your bones are also bigger and stronger. So the two go hand in hand. It's that osteoporosis, osteopenia that everybody's trying to avoid. Well, sarcopenia is the loss of muscle, and you don't want to lose either muscle or bone.
Yeah, I think the common thing I always think of is we'll have a patient that does great. Maybe came in for, some hip pain or some knee pain or something like that, very active. And then we'll see them after they've had an injury after a fall and have a huge drop in their function because they were low muscled to begin with. And then after, guess what? If you fracture your femur, you're gonna spend a decent amount of time laying on your back. So those muscles get smaller and smaller. And if they're small to begin with, your ability to recover from that is very difficult. So in general, the more muscle mass you have, the longer you live. That's your lifespan, like how many actual days you're on the planet. But the more muscle you have, the better you live and maintain your independence as you get older. That is health span. So it's an important difference. When we do talks, we just did one at a place that we see a lot of patients from. And the first question I asked in the beginning was, how many people want to live to be 100? And not very many people raised their hands. And I said, okay, let me rephrase that. How many people want to live to be 100 if they could function at 100 the same that they could today? And everybody raised their hands. So figuring that out is going to be what, we spend a ton of time on in terms of physical therapy and, just improving the health of all the people that we work with. So benefits of strength, a recent 10-year observational study of roughly 4,500 subjects. That's a lot of people, guys. I don't know how much research you're reading, but that is a powerful study. Subjects age 50 and older found that those with low muscle mass were at a 40 to 50% greater risk of mortality than control. So taking out all other factors, if they just have more muscle mass, then you're going to live longer. Remember, risk of mortality is risk of death, right? So if you have lower muscle mass, you're at a higher risk of mortality. And also subjects with low muscle mass and or low muscle strength, we talked about a little bit of the differences in that, plus metabolic syndrome. So this is basically being in poor health. Most people, diabetes, I'm not sure what the current up-to-date stats are, but a large percentage of people walking around have diabetes. So if you're combining those two things, had a 3 to 3.33 times greater risk of all-cause mortality. When you see that, that just means any cause of death. So the benefits of strength are clearly outlined there. Next is endurance. So most people kind of, when they associate the word endurance, they're like, oh, okay, how well can you like run or cycle or swim? They think about endurance athletes, people that spend lots of time with their heart rate at a high level. So the ability to sustain activity for a long period of time. Common things that we hear are, I used to be able to do hours and hours of yard work on my feet, be on my feet all day, but I'm not in my 30s anymore. So as I get older, again, you're kind of resigning yourself to be at a lower function. And for sure, like when I'm 90, I'm not going to be as high a functioning as I was at 30, but I also want to maintain my independence. And it's not just, we have tons of our patients that are above 65 that love to do endurance sports like cycling, running, swimming. Most of them just want to be able to do the basic activities that they were able to do when they were younger. So beware of that mindset. The keys to success here is spending as much time in zone 2 as possible. Dan, can you explain what zone 2 means?
Zone 2 is its type of cardio. Basically, it should feel easy. It's kind of the type of cardio you can do strictly breathing through your nose. Should be able to maintain a conversation a little bit uncomfortably, but that's usually a good guideline. If you're going out running, walking, and you can't talk at all, you're definitely above zone 2. If you can keep somewhat of a conversation going and it's a comfortable pace, that's your zone 2.
Yeah. So there's different ways to measure this. Like there's very objective ways to measure this, but those ways typically are cumbersome and most people are not going to do it. The guidelines that Dan gave is really good. It's your heart rate and your respiratory rate is high enough to where you could maintain a conversation with somebody, but you probably wouldn't want to do that for a long period of time. So that's building your endurance. Again, if you want to, set records as an 80-year-old in cycling, swimming, and running, that's a little bit different than if you want to just kind of maintain doing yard work and basic stuff, kind of enjoying the time after we retire. Like you guys hear this every day, so I worked my whole life to get to retirement. And now once I got to retirement, I can't do the things that I want to do. So we're trying to kind of prevent that. Next is VO2 max. So we talked about this. This will kind of we'll try to break this down as easily as possible. We'll get into a little bit of the science for people that are interested in that, but really VO2 max is the maximum rate at which your muscle can extract oxygen from your blood and create energy with it. So that could be like its own several hour talk, but basically the translation is the higher your VO2 max, the fitter you are. That's a term that people are kind of familiar with, and the more that you can do. So Dan, when measuring VO2 max, you want that to be as high as possible. You'll see in the upper right-hand corner, some of you recognize this. This is an actual VO2 max test. So have you guys ever had a VO2 max test? I've never done it. Dan, have you ever done it?
No.
No, Nick, you've never done it?
Nope.
Oh man, we have to go over to the sales and get hooked up on this. It's not a very fun test, but basically it measures a certain level of fitness, and you want to try to be as fit as possible. Now that sounds like super obvious, right? Like if you're fitter than someone else, then the chances of you being more independent and living a longer life, it seems to kind of make sense. But here's what you need to know. A 2018 study in JAMA that followed more than 120,000 people, so this is even more powerful than the last study we looked at, found that someone below average VO2 max for their age and sex, meaning the 25th to 50th percentile. I always think of SAT scores when I think of these, like what percentile you're in. But for percentiles, like if you're below the 50th percentile, if you're right at 50, you'd be average for your demographic, age and sex, right? So anything like 50 to 25, which is on the lower end of fitness, if we're using that term, is at double the risk of all-cause mortality as compared to someone in the top quartile. So we're comparing people from the 50th to the 25th percentile and people basically at 75% and above. So if you're at 75% and above, you're doing good. You're at a pretty high level. If you're comparing the mortality rate of these two groups of people, then it's double the risk being in that lower category. Think about this. A person who smokes has a 40% greater risk of all-cause mortality than someone that does not smoke. So the takeaway here is poor cardiorespiratory fitness. So your fitness is a bigger relative risk factor of death than smoking. Now that's kind of might be like a controversial thing. We're not telling people that smoking is good for you, but what we're trying to say is that your cardiovascular health is really, really important and can be indicative of not just your lifespan, but your health span. You guys have anything extra to add on that?
No, I think that statistic is crazy to think about.
Yeah. So we'll get more into exactly what that means and how we can prepare you for doing better than someone who smokes. But for now, we'll do the last one, which is mobility. So this is kind of physical therapy is intimately involved in mobility. So the ability to move or be moved freely and easily through space, this can be whole body, individual joints. It's closely tied to everything above. It's hard to exercise successfully without good mobility. So typically, as we age, Dan, what happens? Does our mobility improve or does it get worse?
Most people's gets worse.
Yeah. Okay. So why do you think that is?
I think a lot of it is people start avoiding movements that are getting difficult. They just move less, a lot more sitting. Your body's going to adapt to whatever you're doing. So if you're less active, it doesn't have a need to keep that muscle length, joint mobility, all that stuff. So it kind of decreases it.
Yeah. So we talked about this before, or we see this a lot in our patients. You just start to narrow your activity. So one of the common things that happens as you get older, I just heard a patient that said it this week as well. I asked them that they were having the foot and ankle problem, and I said, "How do you do with stairs?" They're like, "I don't do stairs." And I said, "Like, you just don't do them?" He says, "Well, I live in a ranch. I retired, and had a 2-story house, and then I went to a 1-story house. So I have like a couple steps in the front of my house, but yeah, I don't do steps. It's pretty easy for people to avoid steps in at least in this society." So they just kind of narrow their activity, and exactly what's true is what Dan said is if you start to narrow your activity and stop doing certain things, like I always think of a really good mobility, strength, balance exercise is changing the oil in your car. You got to be able to get underneath your car. You've got to bend down, get on the ground, roll around, get back up. And if you just stop doing things like that, then your body loses the ability to do that. Now, some of that is strength related. Some of it is, related to other things that we talked about. But maybe one of the biggest limiters for that would be your actual mobility. Can you get down on the ground and get into small spaces and do things like that? The takeaway from this is if you narrow your activity, you start eliminating things that you do from normal activity, then hopefully it should make sense that your mobility is not going to improve. And again, we don't love to use age as an excuse. Well, I'm getting older, so these things should happen. There's plenty of examples of people and I always say, there's plenty of people that I say that are older than you that have really good mobility. So it's possible. They might work on it a little bit more than you, and we'll talk about the prescription and how much you have to kind of invest in doing that. But it's not inevitable that as you get older, all of these things are going to get worse. So what is the prescription? I like to think of this in terms of like, what are my goals as I get older? And here's a great exercise. So you guys can all do this if you're watching this now or you're watching the recording. What are the things that you want to be able to do from a movement perspective in the last decade of your life? So that can be kind of hard to know. I might be in the last decade of my life. If I go get hit by a bus today, then I'm currently in the last decade of my life, but we really don't know when that is. You could take some averages and probably, somewhere in your 80s to 90s, depending on your genetics, and decisions you make from now until then will dictate some of that. But what are the things that you want to do? So for me, like I want to be able to travel. So what is that? What kind of things does that involve? It involves me getting in and out of airplanes, carrying my own luggage. Again, there's ways around that at the airport. But if I want to be able to travel, I've got to be able to do these things. That might seem like a low-level activity to me right now as someone that's in my 40s. But if I don't work on that, I'm going to lose the ability to do that. Spending time with friends and family. So going out to dinner, going to see my grandkids' soccer games. How many patients have you guys treated that have said, I can't go to my kids' soccer games because it's grass, it's an uneven surface, and my balance is not good, and I'm fearful of falling. Or
they stay in the car for it. They just go, but can't get out and do anything. Yeah. Just there's the avoidance of it.
Yeah. So you're just kind of, again, removing that activity from your life, which if you set up a plan and commit to it, I think those are things that you can still continue to do no matter what age you are. So I want to be active. I want to go walking and hiking without restriction. So I want to be able to do those things. And again, right now, it seems like, well, I'll always be able to do that. But if you don't work on this a little bit, then it might be problems. And I just kind of live independently and drive myself around without help. Like those kind of go hand in hand. You'll see in our patients, we'll see, and maybe in your parents or grandparents, you've seen as soon as you can't drive and you lose a lot of independence, you rely on other people to kind of do it. So these are my goals. So I've got to set up a plan to make sure that happens. So putting together a plan for that last decade, you've got to kind of ask, well, how much time am I going to dedicate to this per week. What am I willing to sacrifice to get to my goals? So in order to do these things successfully, I know that I'm going to have to put time, money sometimes, and effort into that endeavor. And what is the cost if I don't prioritize movement? So increasing your all-cause mortality. So we talked about that. Like if I'm like, you know what, I don't do, whatever you want to call cardiovascular exercise. Really, it's getting your heart rate up really high. And even, in my 40s recently, as I've been kind of looking at things, I haven't been doing a lot of that. And just doing some more research into it, it points out that I need to start doing some more of that. But if you don't do that stuff, all cause more, like you're going to die sooner. And then also that last decade of life might not look that well. So that's kind of your health span. So in terms of putting that together, that's what you have to kind of decide. So it really depends on your goals. And I was talking to Dan about this before, and it's just kind of hard. There's people that are watching this that might be in their 20s and 30s. There's people that are watching this that might be in their 60s and 70s. You've got to try to find out what works best for you. And we tried to come up with some basics of this would benefit anybody that would hear this information. But in order to get a more specific, like dialed in plan, then you'd have to kind of meet with us or someone that knows how to kind of structure that. But I thought of just kind of doing like balance. So when we see patients, we always say, no matter what your age or condition, what we would love to see is for you to maintain single limb stance. So stand on one foot for 30 seconds without losing your balance. Another kind of progression for this would be able to do that with your eyes closed for 20 seconds. I think those are things that everybody on the planet should be able to do, or if they can do them, that's a really positive sign. If they cannot do them, that's kind of like a check engine light to something is wrong. So how are you going to be able to do that? Like right now, I can do that pretty easily. I'm much of a struggle with that, but I bet when I'm 90, if I don't do things like yoga and specific balance training, I'm probably going to struggle with that. Remember, that's a skill that we need to continue to work on. In terms of balance, Nick, anything else that you would add to that, like suggestions?
I mean, yes, there's still so many suggestions, but as a starting point, yes, I think that's where it has to be. I mean, just practicing balance, whatever that looks like.
Yep. And like Tai Chi, like any kind of movement.
And that would be the difference, I think, maybe between like I'm standing on one leg right now, like a static balance versus a dynamic balance. And that's maybe Tai Chi, or even just walking slowly, like just practicing things that you have to slowly lift up one foot at a time and go back down so that you're moving through space and still having to balance.
Yeah, strength is tough. I mean, most of the research will link grip strength, like the better your grip strength, then the longer you're going to live, which is kind of a funny measure. I always thought of it as a funny measure, but you have to think of, well, what is the person that has a good grip strength doing in order to get that? They're probably not doing, what do they call those, Nick? The something
Captains of crush grippers.
There you go. They're probably not doing a ton of that. They're probably actually like lifting heavy things every once in a while, or maybe even more than every once in a while. But Dan, I put here, you should be able to straight bar deadlift your own body weight. And I even put a question mark there because we're still, what you guys don't know is Nick and Dan and I are trying to develop some testing and some structure around this. But basically, just lifting heavy things is a really good practice to get into. But in terms of general advice on strength, Dan, what would you tell somebody?
It doesn't take a lot. Like you can do up as little as like 3 to 4 sets of an exercise a week for any one muscle group. As long as you're taking it to like failure or close to failure, you're going to be getting stronger. You can even use like daily activities to work on that, like taking the stairs wherever you're going and going up 2 at a time. It's a good way. Like if you can do that, your legs are at least pretty strong.
Yeah. So working strength into like your daily activity is really important. Nick told me this, and if you've listened to me before, you probably heard me say this, but like if I'm in my 40s now and barring any injury that I might have, I can go up the stairs 2 at a time, or I can run up the stairs without too much trouble. I bet that if I continued to dedicate myself to doing that, which seems kind of, a little bit odd, I guess, but if I keep doing that, at some point, if I can't do that, again, it's another check engine light. Like, why can't I do this? Is there something else going on? But I'm also practicing the activity of doing a little bit of plyometrics and strengthening exercise. So endurance. Can you hike with varying elevations for 2 hours without stopping? That's something for me, based on my goals, I want to be able to do. So homework here is spending as much time as you can in zone 2. We talked about zone 2 and hiking type stuff. So whatever activity that is, whatever you enjoy, if you don't like hiking, then and you really like getting on a bike, then cycling and spending as much time in that as possible is beneficial. And what Dan has shown me in the research is there's really no top end to the value of that. Like, so, well, you know, in general, we want to spend this amount of time per week doing it. But if you spend double or triple that, like the benefit still continues to grow, which is, I find kind of interesting. VO2 max. So again, this is kind of like high end cardiovascular health. So you can do a VO2 max test and then you can measure yourself against your age, typically by decade and sex, but you don't need to go in and do that kind of testing. There's other ways to try to figure that out or get close to it. And one test is that Dan has looked at is how far can you travel in 12 minutes? So it's a 12-minute test. So you just kind of take the distance. It gives you an idea of what your VO2 max is. Remember, the study we talked about is you want to be as high in that as possible, but certainly if you're in the top quartile of that, you're going to be doing way better than if you're in the 25th to 50th percentile when it comes to that 4-year age. So what that looks like is training. So whatever kind of training in zone 2, but that will also help your VO2 max. But every once in a while, you've kind of got to get your heart rate up to a pretty high level and in a safe environment. Add to that,
You got to push it.
you got to push it. So
I think some of the easiest things to think about that would be was like 4 minutes on, 4 minutes off. Just keep going. Did I freeze up or did Travis freeze up?
Travis freezed up.
Okay, Travis froze up. All right, I'll talk about. So Dan, yeah, and then I'll say on that, right? To me, VO2 max, like the simplest way is what 4 minutes on, 4 minutes off, 4 minutes on, 4 minutes off, and do what 4 or 5 rounds of that to be into like, and with that is I mean, it can be running, can be cycling, it can be just doing a body weight exercise, but it has to be you're pushing it as much as you can in that time on, but then on the time off, it's you just stop, right? You're going easy with it. Travis is getting back in here. But yeah, and that's probably the simplest thing to think about some of that type of training, right? Unless you have anything else on that one, Dano.
Yeah, no, I think the Tabata is a popular protocol, and that's just 20 seconds on, 10 seconds off for like 4 minutes total.
But what people need to understand about that is that 20 seconds, you should not ever want to do another 20 seconds of it.
Yeah.
It should be that hard.
yeah. All right. Did you guys get to mobility yet or no?
Nope, we just finished VO2 max.
All right, perfect. So mobility. So can you get into really positions that you don't spend a lot of time in, but can you do them pretty easily? So for us, we like a deep squat stretch. So everybody should be able to stay in that for 5 to 10 minutes. If you can't, again, that's a check engine light. That can have to do with a lot of different factors that are involved there, but basically doing work like yoga, specific mobility training based on deficits. Obviously, when you come in for physical therapy, we evaluate those deficits, but in general, getting down to a deep squat for a little bit and just getting on and off the floor can be a really good mobility exercise, or just spending some time on the floor can help out with mobility. So starting point for each of these would be, balance and mobility, yoga in person or online, or specific mobility routines that you can find on YouTube. Again, not super specific, but better than doing nothing, I would say, as long as you're doing it without pain. Strength, learning multi-joint movements, endurance, 90 minutes a week of zone 2 work. We talked about zone 2 work. So if 90 minutes is like, man, that's just way too much time, start lower and set a goal for trying to get up to somewhere around that. Again, we talked about the high end of the value of getting more time on this does not stop as you continue to add minutes to this. And then VO2 max, getting your heart rate up to a max 2 times a week for 2 to 4 minutes. So that might not seem like very much, but if it's something that you have not done recently, then that might be a struggle for you, but it's a good starting point. All right, so this is my 2 full disclaimer. This is not medical advice and should not be taken as such. If you're going to engage in exercise, it's always a good idea to go into the care of a doctor and a PT. And if you have pain with exercise, that's not okay. I mean, if you have pain with something, you're probably going to avoid doing it. So you're not going to stick with any kind of exercise program. So to get that checked out, you can call 610-841-3555 and get a free screen at any of our offices. You can see our PTs. And yeah, if you start doing some of this stuff and you have pain with it, then again, like, that's kind of like the check engine light of, things are not happening properly, and physical therapy can help you out with that. So next time we're going to take a deeper dive into each of these things. So if you wanted us to talk more about one specific thing here, don't worry, we're going to come out with some more content and webinars around these topics. So stay tuned. Anybody, I'm going to check here in the chat. Yeah, and I'll always, you can email me, travis@robbinsfifty-west.com if you have questions. But if anybody, I don't see any questions in the chat. Although I didn't cue people to put questions in the chat. So if anybody has any questions, they can let us know. We'll stay on for another minute or so. But I don't know, guys, what do you want to cover? Is there one that we should cover first? What do you want to do next? Dan, what's your favorite one of these?
Strength.
Strength. All right, we'll be covering strength next. Yeah, the research on that is nuts. Just the link to longevity and also health span that's associated with an increase in muscle mass is pretty incredible. So maybe we'll cover that. Maybe we'll cover something else. We'll decide. But thanks for coming, and we will see you guys soon. Thanks, Dan. Thanks, Nick.
Thanks. Bye, guys.